please reiterate where you said Bitcoin will be at the end of the year, and then help, as Ricky Ricardo would say, explain that one to me.
Yeah, I don't know. That $2 entry point would have looked pretty good at the end of the year. I think Bitcoin's going up to $200,000 this year. So you would have been sitting pretty. The reason for that, I mean, the fundamental reason for that is I think there's a demand supply mismatch in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is growing up as an institutional asset. It's being vacuumed up by institutional investors, by corporations, and also by governments. There's just not that much Bitcoin to go around. But where I see this prediction looking real in the market, the way I can explain it to you, is this is the first major market pullback in history where Bitcoin has outperformed the equity index. If you go back to 2022, during that market pullback, Bitcoin was 3x on the downside of equities. If you go back to 2018, Bitcoin was a multiple of the pullback we saw in the S&P 500. This time it's basically keeping pace depending on when you measure the start and stop of this pullback. It may be outperforming. That tells me that there's a sustained fundamental bid for Bitcoin. And if we can get some normalization in these markets, I know that's a big if, we'll dig into when that might happen. But if we can get some normalization in these markets, I think that persistent bid is going to drive it back up to new all-time highs at 109. And then above that, and the next place I think it stops is 200K. I think we're going to get there by the end of the year.
All right. Well, I know my brother, I have two older brothers, and my middle brother's probably smiling at that news because he bought Bitcoin a long time ago, not at $2, but he's got some Bitcoin. But let me ask you this. We just had Bitcoin. We just pulled the chart up. It's at 84,000 right now. And it was at 100,000 not too long ago, but a lot of people kind of let go of that position. And so what I hear you saying is, all right, 84,000 for a lot of people is a lot of change, but it would be a great return if it hits the 200,000 mark you're saying. As a novice here, what percentage do you have that you're going to be right on that? 50%, 60%, or 100%?
Oh, it's definitely not 100%. There are scenarios where the world enters a really challenging, sustained economic downturn and risk assets are downward weighted. There's a scenario where Jerome Powell actually drives us into a wall and doesn't play chicken and support the economy that would make that difficult. So, I wouldn't make the prediction if I didn't think it was north of 50, but it's definitely not 100. There's nothing certain under the sun. I will say I'm very confident that you're going to see a decoupling between Bitcoin and stocks over the next year. I think Bitcoin will strongly outperform the S&P 500 as it has in most years in its history. There's just a persistent secular bull market in Bitcoin. And I don't think there's anything about tariffs that's going to stop that. So north of 50, shy of 100.
Okay, so my dad, who was his undergraduate degree was, he was an economist, but he never practiced it. But he used to say when people talk about hedging before cryptocurrencies were around, he would talk about gold, and he would say the problem with gold is you can't eat it. So we have gold now. It crossed over $3,300, highest point ever. It's expected to go even higher. Why would you choose Bitcoin over gold as a hedge? Because for those of us, again, who are novices, there's a lot of fear when it comes to cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin.
Yeah, absolutely. It depends on what you want to do with your portfolio. When you add gold to a portfolio, what you do is you keep the same return, but you lower your risk. When you add Bitcoin to your portfolio, you keep the same level of volatility, but you increase your returns. There's sort of two sides of the spectrum. When I think about it as a hedge, you know the old saying about gold, an ounce of gold has bought a good man's suit for the last 1,000 years, and it'll probably buy a good man's suit for the next 1,000 years. It holds its value versus physical goods. The problem with using that as a hedge in a portfolio, and I love gold, is if you put 5% gold into your portfolio, you've hedged 5% of your portfolio. What about the other 95%? The beauty of Bitcoin, because it's emerging as a store of value asset, the same way gold did for what it's worth in the 1970s when we got off the gold standard and you saw it went from $35 to $800. Bitcoin is in that same emergent phenomenon, is you could add 2, 3, 4% Bitcoin to your portfolio and hedge the entire thing against the fiat debasement, excess debt, and loss of institutional trust that we're seeing in the market. So it's just a very efficient tool long-term. Short-term, less so. Long-term, it's held up extraordinarily well over any multi-year period you look at.
All right, I just want to let the 300 people watching on X and the others on YouTube and Rumble and LinkedIn and Facebook, you can ask Matt questions about the things we are talking about. Just get into the chat and put your question in. I'll make sure we get there. One of the questions I have when it comes to Bitcoin is what impact would there be if the United States decides to, as President Trump has talked about, create this kind of, I don't even know the right nomenclature for it, but a Bitcoin reserve or a cryptocurrency reserve that would propel prices up, or would it have a different effect?
Oh, that would propel prices up significantly and fast. And here's why. The US already created a strategic Bitcoin reserve. It holds the Bitcoin that the government has held for about, 10 years, that it seized in the very early days of Bitcoin, holds 200,000 Bitcoin. But the White House executive order on that said that the Treasury shall find ways to add Bitcoin to its portfolio. If the US government starts aggressively buying Bitcoin, what do you think other governments around the world are going to do? I think there will be a cascade of purchases by, dozens of countries around the world rushing to build their position in gold for the digital age. And that would drive prices, perhaps above my target, significantly. So I would note, it sounds crazy, but the US government owns a whole lot of gold. If you look at the store value market, the hard currency market, Bitcoin is $2 trillion, gold is $20 trillion. If you're 100% gold, 0% Bitcoin, you're not holding the market portfolio, right? You need to be at least 10% Bitcoin just to match what the global market is saying the store of value market is. So I don't think it's far-fetched at all for the US and, again, dozens of other countries around the world to start acquiring Bitcoin. It is gold for the digital age. We're moving into a digital world. I think it's going to happen, and it'll contribute to pushing prices higher.
What are the warnings or the triggers that if I'm an investor and I'm willing to part with 84, 85 grand right now, that I should look for to know if the government, if the Treasury follows through on what the president has ordered? Would it be some kind of public announcement, or would it happen quietly? And what should I look for as an investor to figure out, oh, it's happening?
Yeah, I think it would probably be public. I think they would be public about it, or you could trace the wallets, or you would see some activity. There may even be a piece of legislation that passes through Congress that requires the government to do this. There is a piece of legislation at Congress that would have them acquire, 1 million Bitcoin over a period of a number of years. So I think you'll be able to see it. I think you'll be able to know. But what I would really watch is, can it keep outperforming equities as equities fall? If we see continued volatility, but Bitcoin holds above its previous all-time high at 72,000, it's just an extraordinary show of strength. And it tells you clearly, in my mind, that once the broader market stabilizes, this thing is back up to all-time highs and beyond.
We have a question for you, and it's coming from a viewer on X. What happens to the top 100 altcoins if Bitcoin heads north of 250K?
It's a great question. Look, I think we're entering a fundamental era of crypto. It used to be true that crypto had a broad market beta. If Bitcoin rose, then a few months later, Ethereum would go up, and then a few months later, other altcoins would go up, and you just sort of move out the risk spectrum, and you'd see all tides rise. I think that was from a time when crypto was primarily speculative. I think we're moving into an era where crypto is primarily fundamentally driven. Bitcoin is being driven by the fundamentals of institutions, corporations, and governments acquiring it. What will happen to the other 100 altcoins depends on what we see from the fundamental activity in that space. Will Ethereum do well? It depends on how fast stablecoins and real-world assets grow. Will Solana do well? It depends on how that competes with Ethereum. I think you're going to see a wide dispersion of returns amongst those top 100 assets. I would even bet that 70 of them will trend towards zero, and maybe 20 of them will do okay. And then there'll be a handful that return multiples of where they are today. That's the market that I expect to see over the next couple of years.